Okay, I want to welcome everyone back after a delicious lunch break. Thank you again to the Technion and Tali for arranging such amazing conditions for us here. I don't know why, but the philosophers are letting me be the chair of the philosophy session. So I'm going to begin.
You get such a wonderful postdoc.
There you go. I'm going to begin by introducing David, who's going to be giving the main presentation, and then we'll have responses from Michael and Hanan. So David Aldridge is Professor of Education and Philosophy at Edge Hill University in the UK, where he's also the head of the Department of Secondary and Further Education. He's the author of numerous articles and books on philosophy of education and religious education, including A Hermeneutics of Religious Education and How Ought War to be Remembered in Schools. This is an impact publication of the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain. He is a co-editor of the British Educational Research Journal and assistant editor of the Journal of Philosophy of Education. He also co-edits the Routledge Literature and Education book series. So please, David.
Thanks very much indeed. I must say, I'm really grateful to be here. I've been very well looked after. This is the Piazza building at Edge Hill, the Secondary and Further Education Department, home where I would otherwise be, where I'm sure today it's pouring with rain, even though we're moving from spring into summer. So I can't say I'm entirely sorry about that. So a few things. So unapologetically, really, I'm writing about the English context, which I know well, and I'm writing. Well, I'm entertaining the perspective of broadly Western Christian theology, and the idea is that I'm fully aware that there are many theologies. Theology is not one thing. I'm aware that scriptural hermeneutics is not one thing. So I'm anticipating dialogue. I'm also aware that religious education is not one thing. Of course, in any particular national context, it's the product of a very sort of particular contingent history, which could easily have been quite different. That means that its disciplinary associations are different between different national contexts. Also, within a national context, there is not consensus about what religious education is doing. That's true of the English context, and I've considered it an important part of my career, even when it looks like we might be arriving at consensus, to attempt deliberately to destabilise that consensus. So I'm accepting that we're not talking about one thing here. Nevertheless, the broad approach that I want to take, that's not moving. Well, this one?
Yeah, let's see how it works.
It's not moving at all.
Now it works.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you. The broad approach I want to take in sort of quick summary is that in the same way that Michael and Dennis were pointing out, that regardless of one's deeply held beliefs or identity, a better, deeper, more sophisticated understanding of the science will help. I want to say the same of the theology. So regardless of one's particular beliefs or identity, a better or deeper or more sophisticated understanding of the theology are going to be helpful to what we're looking at. I will point out that I'm perhaps not the obvious advocate of academic theology in this discussion. I'm not really, so I don't mind that, because I'm not really a philosopher of education either by training. I'm a classicist. I'm more confident with sort of close reading of literary texts, historical texts. But on the other hand, this isn't entirely hubristic. I've got sort of an interesting, so my doctoral work was in religious education. I was fortunate to work in London with Andrew Wright, who was employing a particular approach to religious education. He was employing the critical realist approach. This was at King's London. This was a fantastic time to be working in London, because Alistair Mcgrath, only very briefly actually for a couple of years, but he'd moved from Oxford, and he was the director of the Centre for Theology, Religion and Culture at King's. So Andrew Wright worked directly with him. And then also Alistair Mcgrath makes a lot of use in his sort of the 3-volume scientific theology opus. He makes quite a lot of use of Roy Bashka. He says, I couldn't really do this project without the critical realism of Roy Bashka. And Roy Bashka was also, towards the end of his life, he was at the Institute of Education at this time. So this was a fantastic opportunity to sort of go from one to the other. I worked very closely with both Mcgrath and Bashka, and I was able to talk to and Andy, and I was able to talk to them all about how they represented each other and how they understood each other, and it was fun. Bashka hadn't read Mcgrath's work. He hadn't particularly read Wright's work. So when I would say Mcgrath says that you say this, he would say, no, that's not what I say at all. And this sort of culminated in, Alistair Mcgrath secured some funding for us to hold a conference in Oxford around critical realism and religious education. And I realised, Andrew Wright's there in the audience, and Mcgrath wasn't there at the time, but Bashka was there doing the keynote. And he said, it's really important, the work that Professor Wright is doing, because it's really important that we're engaging between critical realism and religious education. Now, Andy Wright would say, Bashka's work has made my work possible because it offers an account of why we need to take religious difference seriously. Yeah, and he would say, we're making these different claims. Some of us are making false claims, or all of us are making false claims, but we can't all be making true claims. That was the sort of central bit that he'd taken from Bashka. And then Bashka stood there and said, well, it's very important that Professor Wright is doing this work because, of course, we all know that all religions are one and we're all contained in the cosmic envelope. And there couldn't have been... There sort of couldn't have been a bigger gap in the way that each was presenting the ideas. Yeah, has one particular claim been affirmed in what I'm saying? I don't know which one, yeah, it just goes to show how these great sort of explainers of each other's ideas were quite happy to misrepresent and misunderstand each other. But I did for a long time. So Michael, Hanan, sorry, Rachel, you got this paper when you did, but actually it was late, but it wasn't. It was later than you think it was, because I've been working on this for about 12 years. I would say some of the ideas here. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk through some of these ideas. And as I say, the big summary is I've had some tangential involvement in some religion and science projects. I think I was on the advisory group for one of these projects that I have a few critical things to say about. I often turn up and say, when are we going to do the theology? Surely theology is part of this. When are we going to do it? So I'm not saying that Alistair Mcgrath's theology is the right approach. I'm putting it out there so that we can do the theology. Underneath that broad claim that engaging with the theology, regardless of the deeply held beliefs of the individual, will be useful. By theology, I simply mean so there's a more everyday use of theology, an attempt to make sense of the claims of supposed revelation. You can use that more everyday or more academically. So if you want to talk about disciplinary theology, then it's the academic attempt to make sense of the supposed revelation. I say the supposed revelation. I don't know, actually. I'm sat there when Michael said there's a few atheists in this room that I can't remember exactly what he said, but I thought, who in this room is supposed to feel labelled by this claim? Maybe I am. But I would say that I insert that, the supposed revelation, because I would say I'm at best agnostic about the claim that this is indeed the divine revelation, but that's not really significant for the argument that I want to make. So this is the big overview. So I'm largely dealing with the English context and with Christian theology. I'm going to set out some aspects of what I'm terming a generally apologetic approach to the integration of school science and religious education. And I would say that broadly hasn't changed really in the English context in about 30 years. And there's one particular document that I want to talk about. So Mike Paul's Lion Manual of Science and Belief. I didn't realise when I started teaching, I opened up the filing cabinet in the department that I was working and got out the science and religion documents. it was only when I was looking back at Michael Paul's work recently that I realised that the images we were using on our worksheets, the worksheets followed the chapters of that book, and the images were directly taken from that book. And I would say that's not uncommon in a lot of the approaches to science and religion that are going on in school religious education. So I'm going to suggest that a lot of the projects have been based around this kind of apologetic approach. You know, let's present science and religion with the aim of saying that they don't conflict. You know, and that being a sort of primary and important aim. And I want to go further than that. I want to offer at least one theological perspective that draws a much closer relationship between religion and science. So I'm going to talk about the scientific theology of Alistair Mcgrath. As I say, he acknowledges a debt to the critical realism of Roy Bashka, particular debt to Tom Torrance, who I think he feels is carrying on that project. And then I want to see how that plays out specifically in relation to evolution. And I want to say that often school religious education has not gone through a similar process of historicisation to the one that's going on in school science, where it's quite common to argue for the need to teach history of science and to teach nature of science. And I'm going to argue that looking at some of the sort of presentation of evolution and its implications for arguments for God's existence could benefit from a similar kind of historicisation. And finally, I'm going to argue that evolution is not considered to be a controversial issue either in school science or religious education, but I'm going to be more sensitive to the idea that it's a sensitive issue. But I want to finally argue that the benefit of teaching evolution as a historical event, so the Darwin's arrival at evolution as a historical event within rather than outside of natural theology, is to provide young people with interpretive resources that will enable them to participate more intelligently in conversations about the engagement of science and religion, and potentially to mitigate an epistemic injustice. And I debated whether I was going to put it on the first slide, but I think I'm going to connect this to discussions around powerful knowledge. So that's a little bit of a move for me, because in terms of when I'm working on curriculum justification, the justification of RE, the prioritisation of RE or not within the curriculum, I don't find Michael Young's social realist account of powerful knowledge to be particularly useful. It breaks down in relation to RE because RE doesn't have an obvious disciplinary identity. You know, the approach is to say, well, it's one discipline, it's theology. No, it's not. It's one discipline, it's religious studies. No, it's not. Or it's to say, well, it's all disciplines and they're sort of organised around a concrete object of concern, something like you might say about geography. It's a field, we're broadly concerned with the world. That's also problematic in religious education. So I found that powerful knowledge hasn't been particularly useful there. But when I was doing this from the bottom up, so putting aside my usual concerns of curriculum justification of religious education and looking at, okay, evolution, why is it a controversial issue? How might we address that? I actually found my way towards some intuitions that I think people would have about powerful knowledge, which I was quite happy to endorse. So it's interesting coming from that direction. So that's been really useful here. So in terms of pedagogy as apologetics, so there are lots of projects at the moment, many of which are funded by various Templeton funds in the English context about the relationship between science and religion. So there's the Epistemic Insight Project at Canterbury Christ Church. There's the Oxford Argumentation in Religion and Science Project. And I want to pull out some pedagogical approaches to treating the relationship between the curriculum areas of religion and science that I believe have a long pedigree. As I say, you can attribute a lot of them, I think, to or at least you can see them already exemplified, let's put it that way, in Mike Paul's book in 1990. And I think they still persist in contemporary framings of the research. And here's pulling out a summary of them that you can find, that I've got a bit of work where I go through some of the papers that have come out of the Epistemic Insight Project, and I think you can find these claims represented there, either as direct aims or you can sort of implicitly determine them as aims. So the claims of religion and science don't necessarily conflict, that science and religion offer different types of explanation, that science and religion ask different questions. Sometimes there's also the claim that science cannot or will never be able to answer certain questions. One of the things I'm just going to say very briefly is that there are different ways we could frame the engagement. We can frame this as an engagement between science and religion. but sort of science as an abstract concept and religion as an abstract concept, it's not obvious that that's where we should put the engagement. If we were thinking about it as a disciplinary engagement, we could think of it as a disciplinary engagement perhaps between the natural sciences and theology. And I'm going to suggest it might be useful to think of it that way without necessarily saying that theology is the obvious or complete disciplinary subject area with which to identify religious education. So I don't think it's that this is an exhaustive account of what religious education is about. So I offer those as some of the common claims. And I would say that what I found is that the vast majority of this literature tends to be sociological in approach, so that there's quite a lot of work talking to RE teachers about argumentation in RE, talking to science teachers about their conception of the nature of science, talking to students about how they perceive these things. And what I haven't seen in a lot of these projects has been as much of an engagement with the resources of theology as you often see with that discussion around the nature of science. I can find a few footnotes here and there to Polkinghorne, but they're not really extrapolated or elaborated, really. And I think the motivation of this, it's where you go as a starting point. I think often the starting point here is, hey, we've got to teach both of these things. How can we teach them in such a way that they are seen to be consistent? So it starts off with that sort of what I would call an apologetics, rather than a connection with powerful disciplinary knowledge, for example, that of contemporary theology. That's kind of where I'm going. So you can understand the desire to emphasize the difference between science and theology, because then they can leave each other alone by offering different explanations, or they can complement each other by answering separate and incommensurable questions. But I think this approach has the effect of perpetuating certain dichotomies. You often find these explicitly perpetuated in the literature: faith and reason, fact and value, matter and meaning. And I'm already aware that there is good work there to sort of, problematize this by crossing over the terms, so of course science is a matter of faith and science is attempting to do meaning, and religion of course can apply reason rigorously to the claims. But I want to consider at least one theological approach in which these dichotomies certainly aren't preserved. And I'm going to suggest that there is a cost to not doing this. It's not only that it might be useful, but the cost might be that there's a perpetuation of a particular kind of hermeneutical injustice. And I'll come to that in a bit. So I'm going to be discussing... Oh, yeah, that was the problem. I was supposed to be on that slide. I'm going to be discussing scientific theology. And here I'm using Alistair Mcgrath. I've said that he was self-consciously influenced both by Roy Bashka and by Tom Torrance, a little bit by Polkinghorne as well. And I think this approach is interesting for its claim that theology is a science. I don't think my argument depends on that claim being right. I think my argument is for bringing claims like this from academic theology into the religious education classroom. So advocates of scientific theology, including Mcgrath, have argued for the close relationship rather than the disciplinary distinction between science and theology. In that Mcgrath argues that both are attempts to respond or make sense of the way things are. So as I say, drawing on the critical realist meta-theory of Roy Bashka, and in particular, the claim that our knowledge of the world is layered or stratified into different disciplines because the world itself is so stratified. Bashka calls that his Copernican revolution. There is some bombast to the way Bashka describes his contribution. Mcgrath accounts for the different methods of the natural sciences in terms of their needing to conform to different objects, where the specific methods of science and theology might be different because they are shaped by the different objects they seek to describe. They have in common that they must both proceed a posteriori. Natural theology, and I'll say a little bit more about the use of that term. Natural theology, Mcgrath argues, even where it treats of revelation, which can only be an interpretation of objects accessible in the natural order, is an empirical discipline. Mcgrath considers his scientific theology to be within the tradition of natural theology. You might think of natural theology as a subfield within philosophy of religion, but Mcgrath's is a version that abandons what he calls, at least within the Western intellectual tradition, the default position since the 18th century. Mcgrath goes on to say, this is the view that natural theology refers to an attempt to demonstrate the existence or character of God by an appeal to the order or beauty of the natural world without presupposing or relying on any religious assumptions or beliefs. So that idea that you could simply look at the natural world and reason to God's existence, that's not the natural theology that Mcgrath believes he's doing. Various developments in intellectual history have problematized that earlier project, not least the realization that observation is theory-laden. We don't just see or read off nature, we see it as something, for example, as God's creation or as something devoid of meaning or value. So Mcgrath sees the scientific integration of theology and the natural sciences not as an attempt to reconcile any particular Christian belief with any particular scientific claim, because such efforts, he argues, become outdated with scientific progress. The findings of both the natural sciences and theology, Mcgrath is keen to emphasize, are always provisional. The natural sciences develop, theology develops. Rather, science is about looking for the most satisfying big picture, the one that makes most sense of experimental observations. Whether we're thinking about the origins of the universe or the movements of the planets in the night skies, this is a quote from Mcgrath, the best theory is always going to be the one that weaves together the greatest number of threads, fits the greatest number of snapshots into the panorama. And Mcgrath develops that with an account of science and then says, in natural theology, this is the same project. It's just a question of the scale that we're looking at. So as I say, Mcgrath has a very particular conception of natural theology. He argues that transcendent reality cannot be inferred from the observations of the natural sciences, but is known only if it exists through revelation. Theology for Mcgrath, then, is a science that deals with a special object or layer of reality, the revelation of transcendent reality. Natural theology is a contribution to the discussion of what makes the most sense of the way things are in toto, or in the sense of the ultimately big picture. And he argues that an explanation that incorporates both the findings of the natural sciences and theology's interpretation of revelation is more satisfying and weaves together the greatest number of threads than one that does not. Now, I'm not saying Mcgrath is correct in that argument, but that's where he's located the debate into what is the most satisfying explanation. And it's not it doesn't need to be a kind of reasoned from nothing explanation. It's quite natural that you would begin from where you are. And as I say, Mcgrath specifically argues on behalf of a very specific revelation, creedal Trinitarian Christianity. And that's important. You know, this is an account of the relation of religion and science that excludes other accounts, actually. Now, this matters because Mcgrath is arguing not only that natural theology is compatible with the deepest or the most current and sophisticated understandings of the natural sciences, but that it interweaves with and is transformed by them, as we will see in the case of his discussion of evolution. So going back to Mike Paul's book. So as I say, this is the Lion Manual of Science and Belief. It's a very approachable text. It's gone through lots and lots of iterations. I don't know which edition it's on now. I've got about 3 editions on my shelf. And it's been very influential in school science. Actually, Mike Paul was working at King's when I was there with Mcgrath and with Andy Wright. This goes back at least to 1990. And Paul offers a kind of exemplary, an example of one way of addressing Darwin in religious education. So he writes, throughout the whole evolution debate, there have always been Christians both for and against Darwin's views. When Origin was published, some Christians welcomed it as a further step in tracing how God had created the world. And he also goes on to say how other Christians were quite hostile to it. Mcgrath's account of this historical events here is quite different from Paul's. So Paul really gets us to some Christians, other Christians. That's a quite common approach in English RE. In the GCSE exam, you're often told to say some Christians, other Christians, so you show diversity within a worldview. And that's kind of as far as that one goes. And if you're thinking, in terms of apologetics, that's fine. Some Christians might agree with this, some Christians might not. But Mcgrath argues, firstly, that it's important to recognise that Darwin's postulation of evolution was not solely an event in science, which then required interpretation and critique by theologians. It was already part of that dialogue. So in Mcgrath's account, it was a contribution to the attempt to explain the complexity of the biological world, in which there already was a theological presence. So, if you're telling a strict biology story, you might mention, as Michael did, you might mention Lamarck already being in the mix. But when Mcgrath tells a story, he says, of course, William Paley's teleological argument is also already in the mix and would be obviously part of Darwin's conscious awareness of what he was engaging with. So there you go. So you've got the fact that Darwin's contribution, it was a contribution to the attempt to explain the complexity of the biological world. And there were two significant contenders at the time. There were other versions as well. So Darwin's task, according to Mcgrath, was to show that his theory explained the phenomena better than those of Paley or the transformists. And to cut a long story short, in Mcgrath's view, it unproblematically did. Sorry, not to say unproblematically, but in such a way that these big, compelling accounts are shown to last over time, despite the various problems, and are considered to have sufficient persuasive power to overcome those problems. So Mcgrath inserts all appropriate caveats at this point. The first caveat is that what counts to make a theory better, of course, differs according to the subject matter of the theory. So he says the word best, of course, is notoriously difficult to define in this context. Do we mean the simplest theory, the most elegant, the most natural? These criteria are not predetermined, but emerge during the process of reflection and analysis. And of course, the whole arrival of evolution can be seen as a teaching point in precisely how that works. Mcgrath continues, Darwin believed he could offer a coherent and comprehensive explanation of the biological observations that possessed greater explanatory power than its rivals, such as the doctrine of independent acts of special creation, which of course he does engage directly with. His single theory could offer a coherent explanation of what otherwise had to be seen as disconnected and independent observations. Darwin remarked that light has been shown on several facts which on the belief of independent acts of creation are utterly obscure. So Mcgrath offers further caveats, which are consistent with his critical realist account of the nature of science, that such a theory can never be proved, and that its value does not lie in predictive power. So the value is in accommodating what has been observed. The theory has the status, in Mcgrath's words, of a working hypothesis that is not finally confirmed and may not ultimately be capable of final confirmation, yet it is found to be reliable. And as I said before, Darwin's account is perhaps paradigmatic of a theory of sufficient explanatory power that has earned the right to be allowed to coexist with observations that do not accord and may at times even seem in conflict with it. In the end, some theories die because of their incapacity to deal with such anomalies. Darwin knew this. He also believed his theory would be shown capable of coping with them, even if the final vindication of it lay in the future. And as we've seen, it has gone on to deal with those issues. It's largely agreed in the English context that school science needs to include, along with some treatment of the nature of science, some history of science content, so that students gain an appreciation of how scientific theories are arrived at, how they compete, and how scientific knowledge changes over time. My contention at this point is that education in religion would benefit from a similar process of historicisation that it does not commonly receive. Here I'll just speak anecdotally. And I've observed a lot of RE lessons over my time as a PGCE course leader and onwards. In the case of evolution and special design, it's my experience that Paley's argument for special creation is presented as an attempt to reason from nature to God's existence, on which students might offer differing views. In the context of academic theology, however, Paley's argument is more properly a historical artifact. It is a theory that did not win out, and that particular controversy is no longer live. I'm putting that in the strongest terms, but I think I can defend that. A historicisation of the teaching of religion would have the effect of presenting evolution not as a scientific theory upon which both religious and non-religious interpreters might have different views. Rather, it is a transformative historical event. Natural theology is subsequently post-Darwinian, in that a version of the design argument for God's existence has become untenable. So Paley's argument lost out in natural theology to a better hypothesis. To acknowledge that it's a historical artifact does not constitute a diminishment of intellectual religious belief, but rather its transformation. Proclaiming the failure of a particular kind of religious argument is not a victory for atheist thought over religious. Rather, it has, and hence the title of the paper, it has the effect of redirecting academic attention to where the action is. There are sites of live academic debate and dialogue in the philosophy of religion, for example, over the challenges posed to the natural theological account by the existence of suffering, and design arguments have shifted into the territory, for example, of fine-tuning. So I promised hermeneutical injustice. I'll just deal with that quickly, and then I'll finish. So I'm not going to any great lengths to establish whether or not evolution is a controversial issue. English school science does not treat it as such. With all due caveats about provisionality and proof, and notwithstanding that contemporary biologists are still working to enable all the phenomena to fit the theory, nevertheless, no reasonable case exists for abandoning the theory for an alternative account. According to Dearden's epistemic criterion, then appropriately modified, I think, by hand, evolution, Michael, that is, evolution in its broadest terms is not a controversial issue and should not be treated as such in schools. I would certainly, however, concede to Michael Rice that evolution, even if not controversial in that technical term, is a sensitive issue. And here I think it's important and useful to maintain a distinction between academic, and I'm doing this, the objections I expected to get were around elitism. I don't think they're the ones I am going to get, but I'm sort of aware of that one. To maintain a distinction between academic theology and the lived beliefs of religious communities and individuals. So I kind of expected that people would be saying you're sort of doing down the lived experience of individuals. Although the rejection of evolution no longer makes a serious contribution to the discussions of the disciplinary community, concerned with examining and justifying the doctrines of Christianity, so academic Christian theology, a significant proportion of the population nevertheless rejects the theory of evolution in favour of, for example, young earth creation accounts or literal scriptural interpretation. Again, I don't do much work to contest literal scriptural interpretation. Michael has one very useful page in one of his papers we might want to say more about on whether homosexuality is a controversial issue, where I think you're not going to convince anybody with that one page who doesn't agree with you. On the other hand, I agree with the broad argument that's set up on that page that you know, literal scriptural interpretation in terms of the academic debate is not a serious contributor. So I'm aware of the charges of reducing the study of religion to academic terms and being insufficiently sensitive. So I think this returns us to the serious and ongoing contestation about the proper purposes of religious education and its appropriate disciplinary sources. And here I think the matter, and as I say, it's interesting for me working from evolution, is it controversial, towards how we might address it, rather than I normally do, just say religious education, should it be on the curriculum, why, and how much time should it get? So the matter here is of balancing the harm of insensitivity against another kind of harm. And the specific kind of harm I'm thinking about here is what Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice, which is caused by structural prejudice in the economy of collective hermeneutical resources, or to put it another way, when someone is at an unfair disadvantage in terms of making sense of their social experiences. Joyanne Mercer notes that religious educators may sometimes be responsible for acts of hermeneutical injustice, for example, by not making available in an accessible manner the resources of contemporary scholarship that could help learners make sense of troublesome matters like scriptural inconsistencies or clashes between ancient and contemporary cosmologies. What makes what might otherwise be a simple gap in knowledge into an injustice is where such beliefs are inequitably distributed according to ethnicity, gender, background, community, and so on. So I agree that while we need to be sensitive to the origins of children's deeply held beliefs, which might be within their family backgrounds and their faith communities with which they identify, we should also acknowledge that some children will be at an interpretive disadvantage in matters of the academic exploration of questions of faith, precisely because of those backgrounds. So in school science, we seek to connect students with the theories and explanations of an academic discipline rather than folk belief. And I'm arguing that there's a similar approach we might need to take in religious education. So where I've argued in the case of evolution for the need for curriculum religious education to have a more explicit and sophisticated connection with contemporary academic theology, this does not constitute a complete account of the aims of religious education and is certainly not exhaustive even in disciplinary terms. But my argument is that while there is much that is controversial in natural theology and should be taught as such in school science and religious education, the theory of evolution is not part of that content. It's not important, as I've said, for this argument whether Mcgrath is right. So yeah, where the action is. But with regards to the relation of religion and science, Mcgrath does, I think, direct us to where the action is, to the question of what is the most satisfying explanation of the big picture of the natural world and whether or not such an explanation needs to include a transcendent reality. And I'll wind up there. Where it was coming to powerful knowledge is simply it's simply to acknowledge that there is a contribution here to be made by the theological debate about the relation of religion and science. So if the currently popular distinction between common sense and powerful knowledge has any value at all for school religious education, this is where it comes into play. Thank you.
We're going to hold questions for David till we hear the two responses. The first one's from Michael. Tully's going to get up your presentation there, and I'm going to get up your introduction. So Michael Hand is a professor of philosophy of education and university director of postgraduate research at the University of Birmingham. He edits the Impact Pamphlet series and the Bloomsbury Philosophy of Education book series. Michael's research interests are areas of moral, political, religious, and philosophical education. His books include A Theory of Moral Education, Education, Ethics, and Experience, Essays in Honor of Richard Pring, Patriotism in Schools, Philosophy in Schools, and Is Religious Education Possible? Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I don't know what this tells you about Michael Rice and I, but over lunch I learned that when Janet Orchard began her question, I agree with Michael, Michael and I both left firmly convinced that she was agreeing with us. So I hope she'll have an opportunity to speak more later to clarify that dispute for us. Thank you to David for a really interesting paper. Lots to think about, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice, but I will say I think there's lots we agree on, which is great. Let me move on. Yeah, so there's much on which Aldridge and I agree. We agree that evolution should not be taught as controversial, and we broadly agree on why it should not be taught as controversial. Do I need to move the...
Oh, if you want to move the Zoom over slightly, I can do that.
Maybe you could do that for me, yeah. That would be great, thank you. Oh yeah, great, thank you. So he writes, evolution is not to be considered a controversial issue either in social school science or religious education. And then again, according to Dearden's epistemic criterion, appropriately modified by hand, evolution in its broadest sense is not a controversial issue and should not be treated as such in school. So on that, we agree. And that perhaps is the most substantive question before us today. So the things I'm going to focus on, the points upon which I think we disagree, but they may not be the issues of real moment. Let me just say something about the epistemic criterion. Dearden formulates it like this: a matter is controversial if contrary views can be held on it without those views being contrary to reason. It's not quite true that I modify the criterion. I accept that that is the way to formulate the criterion, but I do modify slightly the argument for it. So this is how I defend that criterion. I say, if we're serious about promoting rationality, we must also be serious about teaching pupils to judge candidates for belief against the evidence or arguments in their support, either to refrain from endorsing claims that enjoy the support of compelling evidence, or to endorse claims for which the evidence is weak or ambiguous, is to undermine the core educational aim of nurturing rational thought and action. So that roughly is why I was disagreeing with Michael Rice earlier in his claim that we don't have to teach for acceptance of evolution. If it's right that evolution enjoys the support of compelling evidence, I do think we fail in our duty to promote the rationality of students if we don't help them see that that therefore obligates them to accept the theory of evolution. So I think if we're serious about teaching, promoting rationality, then we do have to encourage, accept. Now, by encourage, I don't of course mean bash people over the head with it until they submit. I mean that the intention or the aim of our teaching on this topic is to show young people that the evidence here does settle the matter. This is a matter in which knowledge is available and to be had. So I don't think fundamentally Dave and I disagree about that. What I do think we disagree about is the place of theology in religious education. So notwithstanding the significant overlap in our views, I disagree with Aldridge. I'll say Dave. I disagree with Dave about the place of theology in education about religion. Specifically, I disagree with his proposal that education about religion is properly understood in whole or in part as education in theology, and with his contention that insofar as schools fail to educate young people in theology, they are responsible for a kind of hermeneutical injustice. So those are the points I'll focus on now. So why is he tempted by the thought that religious education is at least in part education in theology? So he comments, and he's quite right about this, there's a striking asymmetry in talk of the relationship between science and religion, or the claims of science and religion. And the reason for that is that science is a form of academic study and religion isn't. And we can remove the asymmetry, Aldridge suggests, if we make our subject matter much clearer, if we substitute theology for religion. So his suggestion is that we can bring much more, it's a much more meaningful, we can have a much more meaningful debate if we assume that when we're talking about the teaching of religion, we're really talking about the teaching of theology, because theology and science at least have in common that they're both academic disciplines, both attempts to get things right about the world. So roughly, as the discipline of science stands to natural phenomena, so the discipline of theology stands to religious phenomena. On Dave's account, evolution should not be taught as controversial in religious education lessons because it's not seriously disputed by academic theologians. In the 19th century, there was a lively debate in theology about the relative merits of Darwin's evolutionary theory and Paley's theology of individual special divine creation. And Dave says, in the context of academic theology, however, Paley's argument is more properly a historical artifact. It's a theory that did not win out. That particular controversy is no longer live. So just as in science, the reason we can teach the truth of evolution is because evolution has been satisfactorily vindicated by scientific evidence. Similarly, in theology, on Dave's account, the quarrel between Darwin and Paley in the 19th century was also definitively settled in Darwin's favour. And so in theology too, for the same sort of reasons as in science, we can teach the truth of evolution. Okay, so what's wrong with that? I think there are good reasons to resist the idea that education about religion should take the form of education in theology. theology is fundamentally confessional. It is fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding. It is disciplined, faithful inquiry into the nature, works, and will of God. This isn't say for 1 minute that it isn't a robust and serious and credible academic discipline, but it is to say that it's a discipline that's premised on faith. Its starting point is religious faith. And I take it as read that, and perhaps I shouldn't for the purposes of this audience, but I don't have time and space to argue that we shouldn't be supporting confessional or faith-based education. We shouldn't be supporting schools that attempt to inculcate or perpetuate a particular religious faith. And if that's right, and if theology is confessional, well, then we can't base religious education in schools on theology. There's no more justification for educating children in theology than for educating them in doctrine or prayer or worship. The appropriate disciplinary bases for the study of religion in schools, and I'm very much in favour of the study of religion in schools, are philosophy, history, sociology, and psychology. We can study religion in all of those ways. We can ask the fundamental questions about the truth of religious claims from a philosophical point of view. We can attempt to understand different articulations of religious doctrines and theologies over the course of time in history, and we can try and understand the psychology of religious believers. But those are the only ways in which it's appropriate or permissible to study religion in the schooling of children. It's also problematic to tie the epistemic criterion to what is seriously disputed by academic theologians. So this is a slight puzzle about Dave's paper. On the one hand, he says he's endorsing the epistemic criterion in roughly the way that Dearden and I understand it. But then he also takes as a proxy for what's known and what's not known, what's disputed and what's not disputed in theology. So the question of whether or not there is decisive evidence for evolution is different from the question of whether there is dispute about evolution among theologians. I think Dave's only able to claim that evolution is undisputed in theology by discounting theologians employed in fundamentalist and evangelical colleges and universities. So it's true that theologians working in universities like Dave and I work in, and probably like most people here work in the kind of theology practiced in those theology departments probably does take it as read that evolution is true. But then not all theology departments in all institutions of higher education are like that. There are lots of conservative and fundamentalist Christian colleges across North America, for example, in which theologians absolutely do not regard it as unproblematically true that evolution is true. So I think Dave can only make his version of the epistemic criterion work by taking into account a partial set of the community of academic theologians. And precisely because theology is a confessional enterprise, what is undisputed by theologians is a poor proxy for what is evidentially settled. If it's right that theology is faith-seeking understanding, and if faith by definition goes beyond the evidence, then theologians may find themselves disagreeing about all sorts of things which have little to do with the question of what is or isn't evidentially settled. So I don't think we can use Dave's strategy for determining what's controversial and what isn't in religious education. What about this question of hermeneutical injustice? So the thought here is that we do an injustice to some young people if we don't induct them into academic theology. The children Dave principally has in mind here are those raised in conservative religious homes. So he writes, while we need to be sensitive to the origins of children's deeply held beliefs in the family backgrounds and faith communities with which they identify, we should acknowledge also that some children will be at an interpretive disadvantage in matters of the academic exploration of questions of faith precisely because of those backgrounds. So the thought here is that some children are raised in homes and in faith communities where they're simply not exposed to the sorts of sophisticated theology that goes on in secular universities in which evolution is widely accepted. They will be exposed only to a fairly simplistic or fundamentalist understanding of religious texts. And we do those children down if we don't show them that there are theological discourses that are a little more sophisticated than the ones they've been inducted into so far. He continues, young people might take their community's rejection of evolution to be decisive. Connecting such people with the resources of academic theology constitutes, therefore, an attempt to mitigate a hermeneutical injustice. So Dave agrees with the theologian Joyce Ann Mercer that religious educators may be responsible for acts of hermeneutical epistemic injustice if they fail to make available the theological resources that could help adult learners make sense of troublesome matters like scriptural inconsistencies or clashes between ancient and contemporary cosmologies. Now, I should say, although I'm going to disagree with Dave here, I do see the appeal of this point, that it is quite an attractive thought that we can help children who have only been exposed in their lives to a very fundamentalist or conservative set of theological resources, that we can help them by exposing them to a different set. So I'm not totally unable to see why Dave finds this an attractive thought, but I do think it's a mistaken line to go down. Note first that Mercer, the theologian he cites, is talking specifically about religious educators in universities and about making theological resources available to adult students in theological education. So I think that's quite a different context that Mercer's addressing than the compulsory education of all young people. This is significant. Academic staff in departments of theology may well be guilty of perpetrating a hermeneutical injustice, and are certainly guilty of just not doing their job, insofar as they fail to make theological resources available to students. I take it if a student has signed up for a theology course at a university, well then absolutely, it's the job of the instructors on that course to make the full range of theological resources available to them. But it does not follow that teachers in schools have an obligation to make those resources available to children. I contend that it's precisely not the job of teachers in schools to furnish children from conservative religious homes with the theological resources needed to make sense of troublesome matters like scriptural inconsistencies or clashes between ancient and contemporary cosmologies. One obvious reason for that is that the idea that such inconsistencies and clashes can be resolved or made sense of is already an article of faith. Right? It's already a particular liberal theological view that supposes we can explain away or reconcile or deal with these fundamental inconsistencies. So we're engaged in a fundamentally confessional task if the idea is, well, we can hold on to these children who've had a very restricted diet of theology. We can hold on to them and keep them in the faith by showing them these liberal techniques for resolving the ambiguities. That automatically already assumes that we're on board with a broadly speaking confessional educational agenda. Schools have no remit to guide pupils of faith in the journey from a simple to a sophisticated theology or a conservative to a liberal one. Okay, so finally, what is the proper place of theology in religious education? How, if at all, should theology feature in the compulsory education of children? Not, contra Dave, as the disciplinary lens through which the phenomena of religion are examined. Rather, theology is itself one of the religious phenomena to be understood. Theology is a religious practice, the practice of faith-seeking understanding, and properly belongs among the objects of study in school religious education. So the idea here is what we shouldn't do is assume that just as we're educating children in science lessons, in RE lessons, we're educating them in theology to see the world theologically. Rather, we should understand theology as one of the religious practices that we're trying to educate children about in religious education. We want to draw on the resources of the such disciplines as philosophy, history, and sociology to understand what it is theologians are doing, but we're not encouraging children to actually look at the world through these theological lenses. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Of course, we've left the last word to Hanan.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. Didn't even break.
Didn't break. Thank you.
Rabbi Hanan Alexander is professor of philosophy of education in the Department of Learning and Teaching Sciences at the University of Haifa, where he served as the head of the Center for Jewish and Democratic Education, Dean of Students, and Dean of the Faculty of Education. He is also a visiting professor in the Graduate School of Education and current visiting professor of Israel Studies in the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, visiting fellow in St. Edmunds College, Cambridge University, and chair of the Committee on Values Education, Guidelines for Measurement and Evaluation of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, a fellow of the Philosophy of Education Society, International Seminar on Religious Education and Values, and past president of the Religious Education Association. His research interests include political, religious, spiritual, moral, and Jewish education, and the philosophy of educational research.
You don't have a presentation,
I have a presentation, but I don't have a. No, I don't have one. I actually thought we could use a break from trying to look at the person and follow what they have to say and look what's written on the board at the same time. It also follows from having a week to write the response. I'm going to take us down a slightly different path, though there's going to be a lot of overlap and interaction between what I have to say and what Michael had to say, but from a different point of view, also highlighting places where we've disagreed in the past, and I think places where we agree, and places where we've also disagreed in the past where I think we continue to disagree. But I'm not going to highlight those in particular, or the places where I agree with or disagree with Dave. I am grateful to David for his excellent paper, especially because it's from a British Christian perspective. This is an important perspective for us in this project. We had wanted to study the teaching of evolution among Jews, Muslims, and Christians in Israel. But as you will see when we start talking about the data, because Christians are such a small minority here, we found little data dealing with their views. So we ended up focusing on Jews and Muslims. In this connection, the fact that David offers us a Christian perspective, and then we sort of engage in a lively conversation about how this plays out in a question in a society that is primarily Christian, allows us to sort of to correct that imbalance. And I think that's an important contribution to the conversation that we can have as a whole afterwards. But in this connection, I'd like to make 3 points in response to David's paper that perhaps can help to frame the conversation we're going to have in the Israeli context, because that's the purpose of among the purposes of our project. First, I want to say something about Jewish theology in the Israeli context. That'll help us also understand a little bit about the schools that I talked about earlier. The second, I'd like to offer another take on the term natural theology, one that I've developed in my own work that I think is particularly useful to this Israeli context. And third, I'd like to say something about this thing I call Pedagogy of Difference, which is an educational philosophy that draws on this alternative account of natural theology, and that serves as a background in some sense for the study that we've been doing here in Israel. So here goes. First, aspects of Jewish theology relevant to our study. Jewishness has historically been comprised, I use the term Jewishness because it's actually hard to figure out what term. Jewishness in English is actually a bit of an awkward term, but it's actually hard to figure out what term to use, because any term you use, it already sort of stakes your claim someplace. So I picked this awkward one that sort of sits nowhere, so that I'm not staking a claim anywhere. Jewishness has historically been comprised of a collective or political and a faith-based or religious component, both. There's both a political line in Jewish thought and a religious line in Jewish thought, very broadly conceived. However, God talk very rarely resides at the center of Jewish theology. It's not that medieval Jewish philosophers haven't taken Aristotle's 5 ways and tried to prove God's existence, stuff like that. It's just not, for reasons that I'll say in a few minutes, it's not the heart of the discussion. During the first 2 Jewish commonwealths, from around 1200 before the Common Era until the Roman conquest in the year 70 CE, those who later became known as Judeans, or now Jews, they were then called Israelites, Hebrews, and a few other names. They were ruled by political leaders, known sometimes as judges, other times as kings, and with a few other names. Religious figures such as priests and prophets were spiritual and cultural, but not political leaders. They weren't the people that actually exercised power. For most of the 2,000 years between the Roman conquest and the establishment of the State of Israel, however, one form or another of Jewish religion, as defined by rabbis of one orientation or another, moved to the center stage of Jewish life, to which Jewish political identity became subservient. Zionism, and I'm on purpose focusing on Zionism because, especially in an academic context, Zionism has become a contested term or a problematized term, oftentimes thinking about it from the outside, from the perspective of what it means for Palestinians, a very worthwhile endeavor to be sure, but not necessarily thinking about what it means from the inside of the context of Jewish thought and Jewish history. But I'm taking that sort of Jewish insider's point of view. Zionism constitutes a reassertion of the centrality of political identity to Jewish life in ways that can be organized into a modern nation state. In terms of what might be broadly called the faith side of Jewishness, that's a bit of a hard thing to say because I'm going to talk about some people that don't think they participate in faith, but that belief side, that idea side of Jewishness, in terms of what you might call the faith, in quotation marks, side of Jewishness, Zionists can be divided roughly into two camps: secular humanists and traditionalists on the one hand, and religious Zionists on the other. Both camps agree that the reestablishment and maintenance of some form of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel must be accomplished by human endeavors rather than divine intervention into history, regardless of whatever else they disagree on. In this, they differ from ultra-Orthodoxy, who, at least in principle, hold that the reestablishment of some form of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel is a rebellion against God. The big theological difference between ultra-Orthodoxy and other forms of Orthodoxy revolves around that issue, around the rise of Zionism. There are other aspects, there are other issues of contestation, but that's the core issue. It's one of the reasons why the ultra-Orthodox are outside. Remember in the four frameworks I talked about, ultra-Orthodox schools are independent. They don't want to be governed by the state that was created, but by that ideological or theological entity with which they fundamentally disagree, even though there are lots of exceptions and changes along the way. For secular humanist Zionists, Judaism is a national culture of the Jewish people, with roots in the Hebrew Bible and the values of Rabbinic Judaism, interpreted in light of modern ideas with origins, among other places, in the European Enlightenment. For them, the establishment of the State of Israel is a break with Orthodox religion, including the belief that the Jewish return to the land of Israel could only be accomplished by divine intervention. Many, if not most, secular Zionists are agnostic or atheist. Those definitely are people that Michael was referring to when he was talking about the atheists. And they were proudly so, assertively so, unembarrassed in the statement. Most Israelis in the communities that we're talking about, certainly in the general schools, are of that form of, you might call it unbelief, or form of belief. This is the view that pervades the general Jewish state schools, which also serves traditionalists whose families hail mostly from North Africa and the Middle East. The Zionism of these traditionalists draws on many biblical, rabbinic, and Jewish liturgical sources. Like secular humanists, they do not feel obliged to any form of strict religious observance, although the positive form of Jewish expression followed by those traditionalists tends to be less ideological secular than among the humanists. But one shouldn't assume that secular humanists or traditionalists don't have positive beliefs about what it means for them to be Jewish. That very large population have very clear, you could call them theological beliefs, in the way that I'm going to define theology in a minute, very clear beliefs about what it means for them to be Jewish. Their attitudes toward religion is sometimes the traditionalist attitudes toward religion is somewhat similar to the attitudes of non-observant Muslims in the countries from which their families came to Israel in the early decades of the state. Nijman is going to talk a little bit about that population, and there's a strong overlap between not the substitute Jews, the revelations or the text to which they refer, but the way in which they approach the understand their cultural similarities that we'll find, and we'll hear more about those later. Religious Zionists, on the other hand, view Judaism in terms of Orthodox religion, defined by the teachings of the rabbinic sages through the ages. For them, following Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the establishment of the state of Israel is not a product of divine redemption, it's the precursor to the divine redemption. The Hebrew term Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. That has a huge number of political complexities, which we're not going to have to talk about here, but are relevant to our topic. The role of Jewish theology, in their view, is to explain why we should observe God's commandments, not to prove God's existence. Hence, in state religious schools, teaching and learning of religion, and to some extent also science, aims to promote observance of God's commandments, which will foster, among other virtues, a personal relationship with both the Holy Blessed One, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is one of the aphorisms for God, and with the Jewish people. So that's sort of a broad take on some of the main ideas of Jewish theology in the sense that inform the schools here. So the debates precisely about whether theology is the discipline, or whether we can or can't prove God's existence, or have an academic debate about God's existence, is not exactly the topic at hand. And for that reason, I want to offer another account of what I've actually borrowed the term natural theology, but not from Mcgrath, but from Paul Tillich and John Dewey, to take another account. So following, in my first book, Reclaiming Goodness, I followed Paul Tillich's idea of a theology of culture and John Dewey's notion of a common faith by conceiving of natural theology as a normative rather than descriptive discipline. This account of theology, natural theology, is concerned with what we cherish most, with our ultimate ends or high ideals. Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor referred to these high ideals as first rather than second order values, the values that we use to evaluate other values. I have called these first order values higher rather than highest goods, as you sometimes find among philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and Kant, to leave open the pragmatic possibility. Ayelet gave praise to pragmatism. I myself count myself among the pragmatists. I think it's a very serious philosophical tradition. To leave open the pragmatic possibility that the ways in which we evaluate things today might change over time based on experience. For example, as we counter ways of life other than our own, other ways of evaluating things. Among other advantages, this account of natural theology creates the possibility of a philosophical theological language that allows for a conversation among secular humanists and traditionalists on the one hand, and religious Zionists on the other. An intellectual common space, as it were, where followers of these orientations can deliberate, agree on a few issues, probably disagree on many others, but have a conversation amongst one another, something that in fact is very hard for us to do in this country, and it's becoming increasingly more difficult. In this view, the God of the Hebrew Bible, whether a real person or a mere symbol, mere in quotation marks, symbol, can be understood as an embodiment of first order values or higher goods. In particular, the first order values or higher goods of the Jewish people. Following the relational or dialogical philosopher, the Israeli Jewish philosopher Martin Buber referred to this account of the biblical God as eternally thou in his contrast between I and thou. In this spirit, and influenced by Taylor's concept of human agency, I have referred to this understanding of the biblical God as a model for moral agency. Doesn't mean that God's always right. There's lots of times in the Bible in which God turns out to be wrong. A model for moral agency, and as God in the Bible goes about trying to behave as a moral agent. And I could talk a lot more about that. In Reclaiming Goodness, I also argued that first order values or higher goods are embedded in communities which offer criteria against which we can assess our visions of who we choose to be, accounts, as it were, of our best selves. I called the ways of life that inform these communities quote unquote, intelligent spiritualities. I use the term spirituality here to refer to answers to the classical ethical question, how ought one to live? I have recently come to use additional expressions such as worldviews and narratives to convey this idea, since they're less religiously loaded than the term spirituality. But I use the term intelligent in this context, following Nell Nodding's little book, Philosophy of Education, Nell Nodding's little book, Education or Educating for Intelligent Belief and Unbelief, where she argues that intelligent believers and unbelievers have more in common with one another than they have in common with unintelligent believers and unbelievers. And what is it that they have in common? Their willingness to engage in a conversation or dialogue with one another. So part of what I'm trying to do is actually create the space, the intellectual common space in which that conversation can take place. There are those who don't want to participate in that conversation, but there are plenty that do. And the question is, how can we create a basis for that? And this leads me to this idea of pedagogy of difference, which I won't, when we started this, we thought it was sort of the basis of our study. I think it's turned out more to be sort of in the background of our study than the basis for our study, but it's certainly relevant nonetheless. So in my second book, Reimagining Liberal Education, I argue that because there is no view from nowhere, to use Thomas Nagel's felicitous phrase, we have to begin with a view from somewhere. That is, not only are we entitled to initiate into a community with a vision of a higher good, a community, as it were, with first-order values, we are essentially compelled to do so if we are to engage in education that is worthwhile in any meaningful sense of the term. Here I follow philosopher of education Thomas Green's idea that in a place where nothing is sacred, moral education cannot gain a foothold. So I call this aspect of teaching and learning pedagogy of the sacred, a pedagogy in which we actually do the things that Michael said we shouldn't be doing. We actually educate youngsters to believe stuff, to have commitments, to actually affiliate themselves, to identify themselves with certain ideals and so on and so forth. The question is, into which possible visions are we entitled to educate? And I suggest that these must be intelligent visions, those willing to engage alternative perspectives in dialogue. This reflects very much, in a very nice way, the program that Ayala described that she was involved in the Upper Galilee. Closed visions would end up ultimately in one form or another of indoctrination, not education, almost no matter how you go about defining the concept of indoctrination. But if we only initiate into a single vision without exposure to alternatives, so this too can become closed to any possible criticism or assessment or change. Hence, in addition to initiation into an intelligent narrative or vision of the good or spirituality, if you like, we need to expose students to alternative perspectives in order to allow them to learn from or about the views of others, whether or not they choose to integrate those views into their own ways of life. I call this pedagogy of difference. Part of what we have been trying to do in this study is to explore whether or to what extent this kind of conceptual framework, which includes intelligent spiritualities, pedagogy of the sacred, and pedagogy of difference, whether this conceptual frame might be useful in developing a dialogue among those who accept the scientific theory of evolution, along with other similar sensitive doctrines, and those who do not. We hypothesized that acceptance of evolution might be more extensive among secular humanists and perhaps traditionalists than religious Zionists or religious Muslims, and have come to examine empirically the degree to which this is so. That data you'll see in the study that is presented. We recognize that most scientists, perhaps all scientists, do not view evolution as a mere narrative or worldview, but rather as a scientific theory supported by hard, indeed overwhelming empirical evidence. That's not only scientists. A lot of people that are not scientists believe that. I, for example, am not a scientist, but I believe that to be the case. And this is fine for those among both the secularists and the religious, the unbelievers and the believers, who see no conflict between biology and their own worldviews or narratives. But might it be possible to invite believers, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, to consider evolution and similar sensitive topics from an outsider's perspective, to gain an understanding of the topic without requiring acceptance or belief? If so, what might such an understanding look like? That was sort of the question I was asking in response to Michael. Today, in our seminar in February, I presented a paper in which I tried to offer some of the contours of what it might look like. How, if at all, might such an understanding be different from that of science insiders, if at all? How might it be similar? And could such an outsider's understanding of science pave the way for other sorts of dialogue among believers and unbelievers in our deeply divided world, or even possibly among believers of different faiths? For example, among those who call Mount Moriah al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary from which Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven, and those who call it Har Habayit, the Temple Mount, where the temples of Solomon, Nehemiah, and Herod are believed once to have stood. I'm done.
Do people, are we going to do the panelists want to come up for the discussion if people have questions? Or?
I know that Boria on Zoom wanted to
I think it's better from here.
Have a few comments, so just let me change the view here.
I didn't see Janet's comment. What'd she say?
She's leaving it ambiguous.
Yeah. Okay, so Boria, do you want to be the first to comment? Let me introduce you for a second.
Okay.
So Dr. Boria Agrest was for many years a very influential chief superintendent of biology in the high school. And she's a biology teacher educator since then, and very much engaged in the discussion about teaching evolution in Israel. So Boria, the stage is yours.
I don't want to speak longly, but I tried to show the teachers in Israel that the way to, that there are some ways, of course, to teach evolution in religious and traditional schools, because also in secular schools, there are many children who are traditional. The way that we suggested to do it is to show to the students that depends, you have to show the students that there are some ways to touch the subject. You have to show that there are many people who don't agree with the theories, and there are people who agree, but you have to explain how does it goes. I used to show them, and I also showed the teacher and wrote about it, that there may be three ways of looking on the ways to try and explain what is your approach to the subject. One way is that there are many people who simply deny each other. People who believe in the religious side will deny the ways that the people who don't believe in the religious side. And the opposite also, people who are not religious at all, and they think that there is no connection between religion and science, they'll deny the religious ideas. And you find it everywhere. Another way that you find people doing, living with their idea of evolution and religion is to try to fit each other, to find religious sources that can help you to understand that maybe that the the religious idea can live together with a scientific idea. And the third the third approach is the approach of dividing the two ideas. How to divide it? To show the children that to show and explain the children that religious sources are not scientific sources, and they don't have any aim to search science, and the religious sources have only religious aims. They don't want to teach us not biology, not geology, and not physics. The religion sources have religious aims. So if you have to be, of course, to bring, of course, materials in order to show it. So if you teach science and the children think that it is controversial and it doesn't fit the religious sources, you have to explain how there is no connection between the religious explanation and the scientific explanation. It will be very easy when you explain it. It will be very easy for the children to understand how can you live together with ideas that seem to be controversial and doesn't fit each other, but you don't have to try and explain science with religion and religion with science. And that is in very, very short words, the way that we try to do it in our schools.
Thank you very much.
So that was a bit of a parallel to how religion and science, David gave us the genealogy of how it's approached in traditional British curricula. You just heard from one of the founders of who educated many science teachers of how to present that here in Israel as well. So there are definitely similarities there. And so your questions that you raised, I think, have relevance here as well. So do we want to open it up to questions? I know we, again, have less time than we thought we would for discussion. Celia, do you want to begin?
Yeah, I just thought I'd come in as the token theologian here. So it's really, well, two things really. I agree and disagree with virtually everybody.
Good.
One thing I'll just home in on the ones which aspects I disagree on, not because otherwise if I spend too long appreciating everything everyone said, it takes too long. And I think the aspect that I disagreed with David on was presupposing that scientific theology was the way of approaching or theology in this discussion, because of course all the examples we use were all Protestants. And so if you look at the Catholic tradition of engagement with evolution and theology, it's very, very different and much more philosophical. So in other words, there are different spins on it depending on which particular theologians you use. Now, that doesn't necessarily matter. It's not in terms of, so in other words, I agree with the importance of exposing students to different theological arguments and debates, because my sense is as well, against Michael, is it's not just about confession. And in fact, when I was teaching at the University of Chester, we were validated through the University of Liverpool, and all our learning outcomes for our students, they couldn't have any confessional statements in them at all, because if they did, it wouldn't have been validated. So I think the presupposition that theology is necessarily confessional is a mistake. At the same time, I also agree with Hanan in the last presentation that we really need to get behind the values in science. So in other words, understand what the values are that drive science, and know that for some people, at least, or some scientists, evolution is far more than just a theory or a neutral theory. It's part of their identity. So in other words, the difference between the commitment that some theologians have or others and science is a little bit more blurred than the way we've been portraying it to date. And if that is the case, then inculcating students in that scientific theory has a slightly different edge to it than simply being a neutral theory to which people may or may not wish to agree. And then finally, the last point is that within evolutionary biology as a whole, there are now, it's now opening up a whole lot of new debates on niche construction theory, extended evolutionary synthesis. Lamarck is coming back into fashion, Bateson and others, even the idea of form, the classic idea of form, as well as other areas in terms of shaping the way evolution progresses. So the idea of constraints is now much more popular rather than just the standard evolutionary approach. So it's much more fluid than I think has been presented so far. So it's not just one theory that then we need to get across. It's a whole cluster of different debates, some of which are more compatible with theology than others. And I think so actually trying to show students the richness of the diversity, both within the theology and within the science, will actually help them make sense of it, I think, rather than having this sort of monochrome, this is the evolutionary theory that you need to believe, these are the confessional positions, this is where the clashes are, how do we make these compatible? It's much more complex than that. So my what I'm trying to advocate is a slightly more complex understanding of both how it's received, but also within the debates as well. So anyway, I hope that's...
Yeah, it certainly seems to echo also what Ayelet was talking about earlier today.
Yeah.
Were there other comments or questions for our philosophy presenters?
So I have two questions or suggestions. I don't know if it's a question or suggestion. So, and it was very, very interesting to listen to all three of you and the differences. One question for Hanan. I really liked all the moves you tried to make. And then if I understood correctly, one of the solutions is the intelligence. So what we aim for is an intelligent discussion between intelligent people who have intellectual curiosity. But if I go with this pragmatic worldview, there's a lot of research showing that intelligence and academic background has a tendency to make debates more extreme. So when you look at debates over climate change, when you look at, or about, I think, vaccination, there's no correlation between your intelligence, your academic background, or your intellectual curiosity. So what would you think about, instead of aiming for like this intelligent, and mind you that this academic world of intelligent analysis, the whole practice is to put things in separate places, right? When you analyze something, the whole idea is to put things in different boxes. What about involvement? So if we aim for a discussion among people who want to be involved, then what you have is, instead of the intellectual practice of dissecting a sentence, you have a practice of blurring boundaries, because that's, for example, the difference between being involved in something and, I don't know, being engaged in something. So I can be engaged in my sports, but I can't be engaged in raising my child. Why? Because the boundaries are blurry there. So if we aim for involvement in the sense of aiming to blur the boundaries, aiming for care, aiming for active involvement, maybe that could be helpful. And I don't have time for my second question. I think I took too much of it.
I'll just say really briefly, I took the term from my teacher, Nell Nutties, and from what I think to be, I thought was this wonderful Nell Nutties. And this wonderful idea that intelligent believers, where she said, intelligent believers and unbelievers have more in common with one another. And both from what she wrote and from many conversations with her, it's a programmatic use of the term intelligent. And programmatic in the sense that what it really means is dialogical. So I'm agreeing with you that the term intelligent here it may not be the best term. I'm sort of describing where I picked it up from, but because you can use it programmatically, but that doesn't mean that everybody's going to understand it that way. And when I give presentations about this, I've gotten other kinds of questions about intelligence as well, because it tends, as it were, to be disrespectful to those views, those people that don't want to engage in a dialogue, because that's a word they're unintelligent, which I also thought was a good criticism. The other reason I took the term intelligent is I was looking for a softer term than rationality. I was looking for a term that involved some kind of intellectual engagement, but that was softer than the kind of rationalism, for example, that Michael was advocating as the basis of what education should be. So I was looking for a term that would help us say, well, what is educational, as it were, as opposed to indoctrination and some of these other bad things. And so I landed on this term intelligent as a kind of soft rationality, but it has that downside. So some of your suggestions, I do use the term engagement for a different purpose, between the view that I've been initiated into, as opposed to those other kinds of views. I engage those views. I don't necessarily accept them. So I would be very open to thinking creatively about better language to describe that. I don't know that involvement does everything it needs to do, in part because I don't think it has that part of that piece of rationality that I'm trying to pick out. But there could well be language that does, and it's worth trying to figure out.